Hi, I'm Adam Sussman, Director of Research at Tab Group, joined by Marcus Cree, VP of Risk Solutions at SunGard, here today to talk about one of the bad boys from the financial crisis, VAR. You know, back in the midst of when banks were collapsing left and right, VAR was often strut out as one of the the evil villains in this story, allowing banks to blow themselves up, taking on too much risk. Fast forward to 2013, we got the clearing mandate that just went through on March 11th. Where does VAR stand today?
Well, it's interesting. It's a fascinating story of either redemption or under the radar. I never went away, depending on which way you want to look at it. Because what's essentially the drive appears to be taking the systemic sting away from it being economic cap, break cap, i.e. that amount that the bank calculates to have as a buffer, and actually centralizing that as margin. But as soon as they got to the complexity of the instruments, of the derivatives, they realized they needed a slightly more sophisticated measure, and so they turned to good old simple historic VAR.
Right.
That is across the board at the CCPs, which I think it's interesting because what it's basically doing is putting the margin as a proxy for that reg cap number.
Right.
Previously, it's just centralizing it, putting it in a slightly more liquid place because there's kind of a pooled responsibility. It's more monitorable because it's single entities as opposed to multiple entities doing their own thing. But there it is. It's VAR. And if you read the CFTC's mandate as they lay it out of what that VAR has to look like, it's a fairly down the line historic VAR.
So do you think that is, do you think that's a good decision that we're still adopting VAR but just moving it from a bilaterally cleared environment to a centrally cleared, or do you think that the market ought to be taking a look at different ways of measuring? No,
I think it's a great decision. I think that the VAR number itself, I think the mistake was the VAR number was a snapshot, a single slice of a distribution. It was never the worst case. And the most misunderstood thing across the general populace in the financial market was that VAR was some kind of worst case. It wasn't. What it was a 2.33 sigma event. Right. It was saying at the 99th percentile, this is your loss. This is the risk we expect you to capitalize. It said nothing about what was happening at 99.1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as you went down. Clearly that's where the catastrophic risks were. Now if you want to do prudent risk management, you start investigating that, and again you can use the distribution, you can look at the shortfall, you can look at the conditional VAR, you can look into that tail and explore it, but the number itself was the capitalization number, which is very similar, slightly different percentile, slightly higher for the central clearing.
But what about people who would argue that VAR doesn't really take into account the behavior of the rest of the market at a time of crisis? That when you do get into that tail, things can get a lot worse, much worse than VAR might predict.
Absolutely, but I think what's interesting is that the fact that CCPs are applying this to interest rate swaps. So these are derivatives which would previously have been done bilaterally.
Right.
It's not being applied to, at the moment, every instrument type, but it's on those complex instruments. And it has, time and time again, proved itself to be the most effective way of dealing with those convex, complex instruments with strange payoff profiles, or certainly not necessarily linear payoff profiles, in a way that allows you to understand capital buffers and positioning, and that's what they've adopted. It does come with a couple of spikes with historic VAR, though.
So you're not concerned that, as some might argue, that all we've done is taken risk that was once spread out amongst many banks, so that if one failed, as long as it didn't bring down the whole system, that's good. One's out, and centralized it within a CCP. So now we actually have something that truly is too big to fail.
No, I'm not, because previously there was a reliance on the bilateral agreements being enforced and the collateralization of those agreements. One of the rules which is there in the rule set is the fact that any existing bilateral trading, which some entities are still allowed to do it, has to be collateralized and capital associated with it in accordance with this new rule. So
Right.
actually, it's part of, I'd turn it around and say it creates a problem of over-collateralization in the market, not under. But I do think they are going to come across certain issues with the time frame of the historic period they use. Because if you look at a 99.7% VAR, to put it into context, it's the worst 3 days out of 1,000. That's what's determining the VAR number.
Right.
Well, 1,000 days equates to what, 5 years? 5 years ago was 2008.
Right.
There were some pretty spiky days at the end of 2008. So what you might actually have is anyone using a 5-year period, as they roll through that period and those spiky days drop off the end,
Right.
then they're going to be lost from the distribution, and you could have a significant reduction in margin at that point because those very spiky days go. Now, when that happens,
So the safer things get, the riskier things get.
it's about understanding what the metric's telling you. It's
Yeah.
telling you the worst 3 days of the last 1,000. Now, if you use 10 years, it's the worst 6 days
Right.
of the last 2,000. So all of a sudden, you're not so worried about those spiky days. If you put the right decay factor in, you can assuage the effect of those. I guess my point is that handled correctly, it can be as effective as it ever was when handled correctly. Handled incorrectly, it can be just as ineffective as it ever was when done so.
Excellent. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. This has been Marcus Cree, VP of Risk Solutions at SunGard, and myself, Adam Sussman, Director of Research at Tab Group. Thanks.